Hey everybody, this is Phil, and this tutorial will cover creating your panoramic curve and mapping your nerve. So first and foremost, we want to map our panoramic curve. So you can see here we've got our axial slice. We can slide this up or down. If you don't see the yellow orientation bar, you can actually use this little feature here to turn this on and off. And you want to map the arch that you're going to treatment plan. So here we're going to map out for the mandible. We'll select our arch creation tool. There's a couple ways you can do this. I'll show you two separate ways. First, I'm going to just map this down the center of the bone. Double click. You can see in our panoramic curve we have a 150 micron slice. You can change this from a very thin slice to 20 millimeters basically. You can see your red line, which is my red panoramic view, and this is now 20 millimeters versus 150 microns, a very, very thin slice. And now that we've mapped our panoramic curve, we can go ahead and map our nerve. And I want to map the nerve at its thinnest point, so the nerve becomes much more prominent. If I mapped it at 20 millimeters, well, I can see it and the height might be correct, but when I mark it, it's not going to be accurate from a buccolingual perspective. So I do want to change it to a thinner slice, and then I can begin to map the nerve. So in this case, I'm going to move my cross-sectional, again, my blue cross-sectional view. You can see here my two arrows moves my cross-sectional view around the arch. If you look in the upper left-hand view, you can see my perpendicular cut moving it around the arch. When I move my arrow or my mouse over my four arrows, you can see this changes the angle of that cross-sectional view. Same thing at the top. It does the same exact thing. Two arrows moves around the arch. Four arrows changes the angle. So I can move my cross-sectional view, and if I'm looking in the lower right, this is my blue view, everything's color-coded, until I see my mental foramen, which I can see here. Now I can make sure that my mouse wheel is on slide. If it's on zoom and I move my mouse wheel, it's going to zoom in and out. If I'm on slide and move my mouse wheel, it's going to slice through or slide through. So on slide, select my nerve mapping tool. I can begin here in my cross-sectional view and do a single click, do another single click and let go, bring my mouse up here, and now you can see where I've begun to map the nerve. Now using my mouse wheel, I'm scrolling out to the buccal, and you can see my foramen. And now scrolling until I get to my next spot of the nerve, and I'm just doing a single click. And I'm scrolling and clicking, scrolling and clicking. And then double click the last one, and you're done. So that's one way to do it. The other way is if I delete my nerve, let's also delete my panoramic curve. And instead of going down the center of the bone, let's map the panoramic curve where the nerve generally travels. So we'll start off here towards the lingual, and you can even see the nerve here. Click. I'm just going up towards the buccal where the nerve travels and around the arch like so. I'm following that general path. Now in my panoramic curve, you can see the nerve is much more prominent in one single view. So that's also another way to do it, which can be easier, but personal preference. The other thing too is when I map my panoramic curve, you can drag these little nodes to the buccal or lingual, and also drag it all the way to the posterior to the edge of the scan. You want to make sure you're looking at the entire scan and you're not shorting yourself. For example, if I look at and map it like this, I'm missing anatomy. So let's stretch this all the way to the edge of the scan. And now I can go ahead and select my nerve mapping tool. I can do the same thing and begin at my foramen. Bring it up, and you can see the entire nerve is showing, and it can be easier to map. I can do the other side. Same thing. Double click, and you can see on the left-hand side, your object toolbar. I can bounce back and forth to my measurements, my implants, nerve canal, and so on, and change the color of one side if I wanted to help differentiate. I can use my little eyeball and hide them both, or hide one at a time. And then I can also change the diameter. The default is 2.5 millimeters. I can give myself a little cushion and change it to 3, 3.5, whatever I want. So now when I move my cross-sectional toolbar around the arch, you can see in the lower right, every time I'm on top of one of these little nodes where I've clicked, you get a little dot down below. And if your dot is a little bit off from where the actual nerve is, of course you can move it if you can see the nerve in that view, and you're good to go. Hey, this is Phil, and this is part 2 of implant planning. So we've created our panoramic curve, and we've mapped our nerve. So what next? Let's go ahead and take some measurements, and there's a couple ways you can do this. You can, number one, select your little ruler, and I can zoom in and first find where I want to take my measurement, change my slicing and my angles, and now do a single click from wherever I want to begin measuring to the next click. And you can see 9.2 millimeters. If I want to take another measurement, I go back to my ruler and I can take another measurement. And down below, you can see I have 2 measurements again. I can hide or change the color or delete each individual one or delete both. That's one way to do it. Another way, if I hit my little drop down triangle, I can select multi-measurement, and now I can take as many measurements as I want without having to go back and forth to my ruler. When I'm done, notice I'm still on my measurement tool, just change it back to my selection tool. Your measurements will be most accurate if you capture them in your cross-sectional view or your axial view for mesial distal measurements. The panoramic curve measurements will be pretty close, but because this view is created from how I create my curve, or I can change the slice thickness, it can affect the accuracy of your measurements. So use your cross-sectional views for your buccolingual dimensions and your height dimensions, and use your axial view for measuring restorative spaces from a mesial distal perspective. And you can also use the axial for buccolingual measurements too. And by the way, you can see that I'm zoomed in on my cross-sectionals down below. And let's zoom back out. Another way to zoom in on that area is under my curve slicing tab, which where we are. And this little icon right here is region of interest tool. Go ahead and select that. And now I can crop out the maxilla. Select OK. And it gets rid of the maxilla in all of my views and gives me a larger canvas to work in, making it easier and more accurate as well. And one more thing to be conscious of is you can see in my cross-sectional view, this is a 150 micron slice, very, very thin, obviously much thinner than the width of an implant. So you have to be conscious of what's happening to the mesial and distal of where you are. So for example, I have to do one of a couple things. So first of all, I can either go back and forth and evaluate the entire area for implant placement, or even better, I can switch this to a 3x3, maximize my view, and now you can see I'm looking at 1.1 millimeter cuts times 9. That's essentially 10 millimeters of edentulous space that I'm evaluating in one view. And on my right-hand side, all of my orientation bars are still available to me, so I can zoom in. And you can see the line on the left correlates to what's happening in my mesial view here. And then the line on the right is my distal aspect, and the one in the center is my center view. And you can also see it over here as well. And I can still change the angle of all of my views from this orientation. And this is a much better view to evaluate the entire space. Again, if I'm looking at just 150 micron slice, I don't know what's happening 2 millimeters to the mesial or the distal. Maybe there's a root tip, maybe there's something there, pathology that I should be concerned about before placing an implant. So you want to be conscious of evaluating the entire area and not just the native resolution of that particular scan. Hey, this is Phil, and this is part 3 of the implant planning tutorial. So in parts 1 and 2, we've already created our panoramic curve, we've mapped our nerve, we've taken measurements in a couple of different ways. We've used the region of interest tool to crop out the maxilla, and a few other things. So what are we doing next? So if we have a 3600, 3700, or if we've object scanned an impression or model, and you have the PDIP module, prosthetic driven implant planning, those will then be available within our model icon over here. So we can select that, and you can see here's a 3600 scan, and we can go ahead and do an automatic alignment with the mandible. And the scan is merged, and we can turn off our wireframes here. You can validate the accuracy of the merge by looking at our cross-sectional view, and the green is your model that's merged over your CBCT. You can see how it's nicely aligned over the occlusal aspect, nice and tight, so that's good. Now obviously you don't have to merge a digital impression scan with every single case, but it can definitely be helpful in a variety of different cases. I'll show you one example here. So we've got this large edentulous span in the maxillary anterior, and obviously placing implants here would be more challenging. But if we merged our digital impression scan and crop out some of the CBCT so we can visualize this a little better, add our crowns, and now when we place our implants, of course, we have a much better visualization of where to place them, angles, and so on. Another good example of how it can be helpful to merge your impression scan and add your crowns is when you have patients with high amounts of scatter, like you can see here. So in this case, I've got it pretty much all planned already, so I'm not going to show you how to do it per se, but just the value of doing it. So you can see here we've merged our model, and I will show you actually a little bit later in the video how to use this region of interest tool, which cleans up our scan nicely. Now, when we add our crowns, everything's really added nice and accurately. You can see everything, all that scatters out of the way, and of course now we can plan our implants much more effectively. So now let's go back to our original plan, and this is where we left off. We've got our cross-sectionals positioned nicely on the lower right side. We've got our model that's merged, or our digital impression. Nerves are mapped out, so ready to add a crown. Again, this is part of the PDIP module, so if you don't have this, you can ask your dealer or your rep, and we're going to select number 30, and places our crown in the general vicinity, and now we're ready to design and position it. So this is where using the region of interest tool can be very helpful. So right now I want to visualize and design the crown, but I've got the maxilla in the way. So one way to remove the maxilla is, like I showed you earlier in a previous video, we can use this little region of interest tool, which is in your curve slicing tab, and crop out the maxilla. But you can see here it's also on this plane, so we're cutting off a little bit of the crowns in the posterior here. Select OK, and it crops out the entire image, all your slice views, and your 3D rendering, and I can visualize things a little bit better that way. So that's one way. Let's put this back. And the other way with the region of interest tool is using this tool down here. Select the little drop-down arrow or triangle, go to 3D region of interest, and it pulls up this image. So what you want to do is position this so I can see all the way through the image at the occlusal plane, because I'm going to use this little cutting tool, draw a shape to remove the inside, or draw a shape to preserve the inside. So either one will suffice. Select it, and now I can zoom in to be a little bit more accurate, and I'm just going to do a single click all the way through. Now I can zoom back out again and cut out the entire maxilla. And now I can label it maxilla. Select OK, and I can do it one more time for the mandible. So it takes, just a little bit longer to do it that way, but I like it because now I have the maxilla and the mandible here under my region of interest, and now I can simply toggle that on and off, making it a lot easier as I go forward, especially when treatment planning larger cases. It's very simple to then just toggle that on and off to visualize what I need to visualize. In this particular case, now I can go ahead and see my crown. So now when we go to our object area, we can select our crown, and this little icon will center all of my views on that crown. And I can also then click on the 3D rendering of the crown and visualize everything here and manipulate exactly how I want. These yellow nodes will increase the crown or decrease in all the dimensions. So every single dimension, it will increase or decrease. And I can grab any of these little colored areas to center and turn. And then when I have the 4 arrows on the crown, that's where I can actually move the whole crown, more of a bodily movement of the crown itself. When I see the 2 arrows in those directions, that means I'm attached to one of the little movement handles to turn it. So in this case, I'd be on the green, and I'm tilting it. Okay. If I want to stretch the crown in one dimension, for example, I want to make it longer, bringing it down closer to the gingiva, I would actually use the little movement handle in one of the other views, or the little movement right here. So when I put my finger on top of this, you can see, or put my mouse on top of this to see my finger, if you look at the lower left, the crown, as I go, you're stretching it in just that one dimension. And I can do the same thing here. And I can do the same thing if I want to stretch the crown buccolingually only and not move the other dimensions. I can grab it here, and now I'm stretching it in just that one dimension. So again, yellow nodes moves it in all dimensions, grabbing it from these other little nodes will move it in that one dimension. Hey, this is Phil, and this is part 4 of the implant planning tutorial. So in parts 1 through 3, we've done all the initial setup with creating our panoramic curve. We've mapped our nerves. We've also played around with different regions of interest tools, such as being able to delete the maxilla or the mandible very easily, toggling those back and forth. Different cross-sectional tools we've also played around with. If you haven't watched parts 1 through 3, you can go ahead and search those and watch those and get up to speed with where we are right now. So right now we're at the point where we want to begin placing the implants. So reminder, we're on version 3.10.12. If you're on an older version, you can download this right from our website. Currently we're lined up on top of our crown in a cross-sectional view, and we're ready to place an implant. So you can take measurements like we've already reviewed in previous videos, but the easier way to do it really is just select your implant. You can turn this tutorial off just by selecting Do Not Show Again. And right now it's still, the implant is currently highlighted still, and you can see it gives you like a little window of where you want to actually begin to take a length measurement. You do one single click, and you'll notice that 8 millimeters is actually the shortest distance it's allowing me to measure. And that's because in the implant system and grouping that I have selected as my favorites in the software, that's the shortest implant. So that's why it's not allowing me to go any further or any shorter than 8 millimeters. You'll also notice after I do my first click, it's the degrees of angle I have compared to where I have my crown placed. So now when we click a second time, it opens up my favorite window of which implant system I'm using, which is my tapered screw vent for Zimmer, and it's also going to recommend the best option based on that length measurement. And if this is the implant that I want, then I can just select OK, or I can actually look at and view each implant as I go. And you can watch in the lower right-hand view, your cross-sectional view, as I select each implant. It's going to change it on the fly so I can help visualize my plan. If I wanted to select a different implant or one of my favorites, I can open this up and I can look at one of these. If I wanted a different one altogether, I can select expand, and then I could add in whichever implant I want from any of the manufacturers that are available in my favorites. Okay, so let's change this back to Zimmer. And if this is the implant that I want, I'm going to go ahead and select OK. So we can see a couple things. We can actually see where the implant is protruding out. The yellow is my restorative space. We can see this little cone to show us, or if you want a better visualization, go into your preferences, go to implant, change your yellow restorative space to 20 millimeters. So now you can much more easily see how that implant is planned and where it's going to project out for restorative purposes. So now we can actually change the angle of the implant. I can zoom in on my cross-sectional view. That gives me a much better view and more canvas to play with, so it's easier. I can do the same thing for my panoramic curve. Okay. You can also see the actual label or the object properties. It shows you what specific implant it is and the size and the dimensions. Sometimes these can get in the way, so I can do one of a couple of things. I can actually just left click and grab it and move it out of the way. Or on my left hand side, you'll notice this whole blue area is opened because this is an implant on number 30. I can left click and it will close that whole window, or left click again on the bar, it will open the entire window. And now you can see actually a variety of options here, which I'll go through in a minute. This little button right here, Show Hide Object Properties, that is there whether or not the blue bar is open. And if I select this, then you can see my object properties are now gone. So now we can more easily manipulate our implants. So you can see here we've got 3 nodes here in our cross-sectional view. We also have 3 nodes in our panoramic curve. And in the cross-sectional view, I can grab the top node, and you can see I'm tilting it from a buccal lingual perspective. When I grab the coronal aspect of the implant, the apical portion of it is on a fulcrum. Same thing goes if I grab the apical part of the implant and the coronal aspect is on a fulcrum. The middle node is more of a bodily movement, and the same thing goes in our panoramic curve. I can grab the coronal aspect of the implant and the apical portion of it stays on a fulcrum, and now I'm actually just changing the angle from a mesial distal perspective. You'll also see in the 3D rendering, as I manipulate the implant, you'll see it change on the fly. Okay, so let's cover some tools here on the left-hand side. So we've got this little eyeball. We can actually hide our implant. This is for this specific implant. If I close this, I would see multiple implants if I have multiple implants treatment planned. And then I can hide all or just one at a time. Okay, let's click on my blue bar to open this back up. I've already showed you the object properties. So we can see here, here's our object properties. Hide those. We can change the color of each implant. If I hover my mouse over this area right here, you can see it shows me the specific implant and the details. This is a useful tool, center at implant. So for example, if my cross-sectional view was somewhere else, and I want to actually visualize the implant or bounce around from implant to implant, I can very easily do that by center at implant. I can do the same thing if again I was somewhere else on my scan and I want to center on a crown, I could do the same thing. Okay. Of course, I can delete my implant, and here this is also very helpful. So if I actually look at my cross-sectional views or my panoramic or both, I can change the length of the implant within that particular grouping. So for example, if I hit my minus sign, if you'll watch your implant over here, you can see it's going to change it to the next shortest implant within that particular implant grouping, or I can increase the size and so on. I can also change the width here right in the actual system itself. I can't go any further because that's the smallest width implant within that particular implant grouping. What I can also do is replace my implant. So currently we have our Zimmer tapered screw vent, but let's say I wanted to choose another implant altogether. If I deleted this and then added a new implant, I would have to reposition and angle that implant all over again. If I select my replace implant icon, I can choose an entirely different implant, select OK, and it automatically places it back to how you originally had it planned. So that should save a lot of time if you're switching implants altogether. This icon here allows me to add an abutment, and you can make it either a straight or angled abutment. You can play around with those features to your liking. I'm not going to go through it entirely on this tutorial. Then you can visualize the implant placement a little better, like I also showed you in previous videos, by looking at your cross-sectional view, not just as a one individual slice that's 150 microns, because that doesn't really tell us that much about that entire edentulous area, but switching to a 3x3 with 1.1 millimeter increments. So now we're looking at roughly 10 millimeters of edentulous space in one single view. And this was all reviewed in more detail in a previous video. So once you actually have your plan, also if you merge your digital impression scan like so, which you would normally do at the beginning of the case, like I showed you in the previous video, but not super important for the purpose of this video. But once you have everything planned, you can obviously just freehand your implant based on your plan, or if you wanted to take it to guide, you could export your data sets and send it to any lab. If you wanted to design it yourself, you've got your Blue Sky planning software right here, so I can do a single click that'll launch Blue Sky planning software with your full plan attached. Something to note, the Blue Sky icon will only show up if you have Blue Sky planning software installed and you have the PDIP module. And then you can design your own guide, export, and print. You can also, with my little drop-down arrow, actually, you can see here, here's a little tip. I click on my drop-down arrow, I've got more icons down below, but they're kind of pushed off of the page. So make sure you close these toolbars. That pulls this export box up, and now I can see what options I have. So you can also export that plan to Swiss Meta for a very unique and effective surgical guide. So definitely check that out. Or 360 Imaging, which is a guided surgery company, which you can take your plan and send it directly to them using 360 Courier, which when you hit that 360 Imaging link, it will launch 360 Courier, fill out your RX, and send that case directly to them. They will then fabricate the guide and send it back to you. So you can do all that directly from the CareStream software. And one last little trick on this tutorial is if I go into oblique slicing, this is just more of a cool factor. You can see here in oblique, I have a cropping tool. So if you want to show this for a little show and tell with your patients, I can move any of these little nodes and crop out my plan. So if I want to have a patient discussion and kind of show them what's happening on the inside, again, probably not necessary for you, but from a cool factor perspective and wow factor, it is pretty nice. Hope this all helps. Feel free to reach out with questions. Thanks.